Good evening, good morning. Welcome to week 3 of PSSL 6240 here at George Washington University's Homeland Security program. Just want to get started with some announcements. Adobe Connect session, as I've mentioned earlier, January 26th, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That is this Thursday. If you are briefing, please send me the PowerPoint presentation ahead of time. And just a quick reminder, again, this isn't required, but this would be a good office hours if you want to talk about the paper, if you want to talk about the course in general. So again, this Thursday, upcoming Thursday, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you are briefing, please send me the slides beforehand. Paper due next Sunday. So the Adobe Connect session's on Thursday. The paper's due the following Sunday, 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I know that if you are, a couple of people have talked to me about issues. Please, if there is an issue, please let me know. But what I'm not going to be too happy is if you give me an issue on Sunday at 11:50 p.m. So I want to make that clear. And again, extensions I'm not going to be too happy about granting extensions, but if there's military duty or something like that, then let me know. Current events. As I'm taping this, we just had we had an election and we had an inauguration. We have a new president. Whether you voted for him or not, it's actually, you should take a certain amount of pride at a peaceful transition of power. That is something that does not happen very common throughout the world. In fact, right now, Gambia in Africa, you're going through issues where the old president does not want to leave. So whether your candidate or not is the current president, I think you should just, again, take a second to just admire how, again, a peaceful transition of power. There are no tanks in the street. There is no violence, nothing that says, I want to hold on to power for whatever reason. And I think everyone can kind of admire that. And then finally, briefings. If you are briefing on Thursday, you had guidance. The same topics as you would for the writing, same format, and we'll talk about that in a second. But just go ahead and brief it. And what we've seen in the past, and I don't want to tell you how to do your briefing, is the group is broken into two. One guy argues for such and such as terrorism. The other side argues rebuttal. And they kind of go into the facets of why one should be terrorism, why should be not. And that's one idea I saw last week that you might be just interested in. But how you want to do it is up to you. If you just want to have one guy briefing, one guy or girl briefing, that's more than acceptable. So I just want to give that guidance out right now. So review of last week. Go ahead and in this email I sent out an example of the paper or example of a previous paper. Go ahead and pause me and review that. And go ahead and do that now. Okay, so welcome back. I hope in that example you saw what I'm looking for. And again, I can't emphasize enough. Pin your argument to those facets of the paper. These are the reasons why I think, in that case, Hamas should be terrorism. And that's not one of your examples, or that's not one of your choices now, but in the past it was. But again, the key point is to pin those facets of why you think this is terrorism. And a lot of you alluded to it in your discussion section. Why is Fort Hood, particularly when you were arguing, I don't say arguing, but debating back and forth of why you think, say, Fort Hood should be terrorism. And some of you thought, well, it's a military target, therefore it shouldn't be terrorism. Others thought, well, it was a military target outside a combatant area, that there were civilians there, that Nidal Hassan was doing had a political jihadist narrative, that he was connected to jihadists. Those are all facets that you just brought up. So again, get into those in detail on your paper. So some of those argument points, facets that we discussed over those criteria, over those incidents that we talked about. Military versus non-military. And I mentioned Nadal Hassan. Some of you were struggling with the USS Cole, which, as I mentioned in the lecture, the National Counterterrorism Center would not consider a terrorist act because that is a military target. Combatant versus non-combatant. This is something that was brought up, Fort Hood, brought up at the Pentagon. A lot of you said that the Pentagon, yes, there's military there, but there are a lot of civilians. There's a lot of civilians at Fort Hood, and therefore they're non-combatants. I would disagree. Again, my opinion. I think if you're a civilian and you're working at the Pentagon, you're a combatant. You are in a military installation. At Fort Hood, if you're preparing troops to go overseas, which is what that was going on, you are a combatant. Those are some of the issues to discuss. I would also add, well, I'll get into a little bit more detail on that. But again, combatant versus non-combatant is a slippery. Well, I'll let you define that in your paper. State versus non-state. Actually, let me state versus non-state. A lot of you, again, said Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, 2 states at war. Therefore, it couldn't be terrorism. Well, we have, just because it's a state and it's blowing up civilians, does that automatically take terrorism off the table? A lot of people think Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism. It is. And they kill a lot of people, in civilians especially, by their proxies. Is that not terrorism? You decide. Is it because we're saying that a B-17 bomber or B-29 bomber, that type of tactic, it can't be terrorism because that's relevant of a state? Well, again, that's arguments you need to either bring up or rebut in one way or another. Targeting within or outside the locus of conflict. Again, the Irgun FLN example, both targeted within the locus of conflict. The Irgun wanted to kill British soldiers only that were affecting Israel. Algeria wanted to kill soldiers and civilians, but only in Algeria itself. You might argue that those aren't terrorist groups, that those are freedom fighters. However, if they had started to target British civilians in London itself, or if the Algerians started to attack France in Paris, does that cross a certain threshold? Again, I'll let you decide. Attacking the apparatus of government. Apparatus of government, apparatus of oppression. Mandela, we talked about Mandela, his target was on police, government officials, those that were actively oppressing the black nationalists, or the black nationals in South Africa. The Irgun was attacking the apparatus of government. The FLN was attacking civilians. It was not the apparatus of government. So is one freedom fighter, the other terrorists? Again, I'll let you decide. War zone versus non-war zone. This was brought up twice. Again, the Fort Hood and the Cole. A lot of you said the Cole was terrorism because it wasn't a war zone. Well, if you are in Yemen and a destroyer comes up on you, that it's going to feel a lot war zone-like to you. If you are at Fort Hood, for you, it's not a war zone. If you're a military guy getting ready to deploy to Iraq, but that's very convenient for you because, again, you're saying it's not a war zone where I'm prepping to go to war, but it's only a war zone where I'm in Iraq and Afghanistan, where I'm armed and ready to go. Well, that logic is if I'm in the military and I conduct a raid on somebody's home that's combatant, is that a war zone? Yeah, I'm saying it's a war zone because that guy's still in Iraq or Afghanistan. But his war zone is the street where he planted his IED, not when he goes home to his family. So what a war zone is depending on your viewpoints. There's, I hate to say this, but if you think Nidal Hasan, he's a soldier of Allah, which is what he claimed to be. If you think he's fighting for the adversary, attacking soldiers that are prepping to go to war, even if they're Fort Hood, that's a war zone, or that's in the war zone for you. We bomb barracks, we bomb things that say, hey, these are combatants, even though they're not actually fighting. It's still a war zone. So again, that's a fungible term, and again, it's something you can clarify in some of these issues. Political narrative. That is what separates the random shooters with the people with more organized links to terrorism. That's what separates the guy at Sandy Hook and the Aurora, Colorado, and Columbine. But does it? Everyone has a political narrative. The guy at Sandy Hook, again, who killed all those children in Connecticut in 2012, he had a political narrative, as distorted it is. The Dylan Roof, the person who in Charleston, certainly had a political narrative. But then we have to ask the question, all right, is it really a political narrative, or is it mental illness disguised as a political narrative? The Fort Hood shooter, Nidal Hasan, probably was mentally ill, and the soldier of Allah and the political narrative was cover for his violent behavior. The guy in Orlando who pledged allegiance to ISIL, that person was probably suffering from sexual identity issues or sexuality issues, and his killing and his pledge to ISIS was more cover for that than being actually associated with ISIS. So again, you have to go into detail on what is a political narrative. Levels of oppression. Again, this goes back to the Mandela argument. Is there a point that you are so oppressed that violence is acceptable? And then are you so oppressed that violence against civilians is acceptable? If you watch that video about the FLN, Ben Bella said the French had everything. They had the arable land. They had all the wealth in Algeria. This was before they discovered oil. That was very oppressive because you couldn't farm. You couldn't develop your people. Is that level of oppression enough to engage in violence? ISIL, or Daesh, or ISIS, whatever we're calling it now, arguably, and again, we're making academic arguments here, they're oppressed. The Sunnis on the Syria side and the Sunnis on the Iraq side were oppressed so enough that arguably ISIL bore out from that oppression. Is that justifiable of violence? If you're in the Holocaust and you're a Jewish group and you engage in violence to stop the Holocaust, is that acceptable? You engage in violence against civilians, you blow up schools, you do things like that. Is that acceptable because you are in a very, very highly oppressed situation? So if you choose that, you'll have to define what is appropriate level of oppression to engage in mass violence. Politically popular versus non-popular. This is what separates an insurgency from a terrorist group. Arguably, again, the idea, and some of you mentioned this, the IED in Iraq against a convoy, that is, I don't want to say acceptable, but not terrorism because it's part of a popular, quote-unquote, guerrilla warfare that might make it more or less, not terrorism, but wartime violence. And then degree of association. This was brought up in the Fort Hood, Nidal Hasan, because he was associated with known terrorists through email communication. That links him to terrorism, or at least furthers the argument that he's a terrorist. But then you have to define what is association. Again, the Orlando shooter, was associated with ISIS. But was he really associated with ISIS? He just pledged allegiance to it after he conducted his mass shooting. Even arguably, Anwar al-Awlaki wasn't associated with terrorism because Nidal Hasan was not associated with terrorism because the communications he had wasn't related to plotting or direct tasking. It was more of inspirational, aspirational types of communication. Again, so you have to define, if you're going to say he's a terrorist, you have to say these are the levels of he's associated with known terrorists, and you have to be able to prepare those or counteract those counter arguments I talked about. So again, I just gave you a list of facets to choose. Please, on your paper, don't go through 10 facets. Choose 3 and drill down on them, or 2, 3, 4, but don't give me a whole laundry list. So again, your paper: intro, short intro, argument, which is your argument points, rebuttal, and then policy recommendations if they're necessary. So if you think that Fort Hood should be switched to terrorism, say your policy recommendation or something on those lines. So that's kind of the structure for the paper, structure for the briefing as well. And then illustrative examples, again, to reiterate: the Irgun, which we talked about this week, a highly oppressed group, if you think about the backdrop of the Holocaust, focus on the apparatus of oppression, the British authorities within the locus of conflict. The FLN, again, highly oppressed, maybe not as oppressed as the Irgun because there's no Holocaust, but it was certainly, as I mentioned earlier, about taking all the arable land in Algeria. Focus on the civilians. That's a huge distinction. The FLN deliberately killed civilians. But it was within the locus of conflict. The civilians were in Algeria. They weren't killing civilians in Paris or in France itself. So again, arguably, well, I don't know how you want to say that, but that might make it less of a terrorist threat. And then Al-Qaeda is the easiest one. It's very hard to say that Al-Qaeda is highly oppressed by the United States. Focused almost entirely on civilians, if you include the 9/11 attacks, and obviously the 9/11 attacks outside the locus of conflict. You could make an argument that if Al-Qaeda focused its attacks because they were upset that the U.S. was occupying Saudi Arabia, and they focused attacks on military targets within the locus of conflict, arguably, you can say they're more an insurgent or a guerrilla warfare than a terrorist group. But again, these are points to make in your paper. So just week 3, Terrorism History Part 2, Road to 9/11 documentary. Again, as I mentioned, it's on YouTube. Excellent documentary. Goes along with the Zakaria Why Do They Hate Us article. So you should watch the video and read the article. Those are linked. And then try and understand social, political, demographic, historical, and cultural factors that led to 9/11. Think through all those factors that led to not just 9/11, but a lot of the anger that you saw in the Arab world that was very shocking to a lot of Americans after 9/11. And when you watch the hit Road to 9/11, while this was produced before ISIS, you could see some of the factors that fueled ISIS as well. And then terrorism finance, that's the second part of week 3. What I just want you to focus on is ISIL finance. So the BBC documentary, as well as the ISIS Inc. article as well. In fact, there's other things in the syllabus. Just focus on those facets for now, because I know you'll be working on your papers a lot and working on the terrorism history piece. So if there's any questions, feel free to email me, and I look forward to the Adobe Connect session and your papers as well as your discussion sections this week.